Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal Rocco Falconeri had always considered himself an ordinary boy living in an extraordinary world, surrounded by the legacy of heroes and protectors. The son of Detective Dante Falconeri and Lulu Spencer, a descendant of two of Port Charles's most storied families, he was told, from a young age, that he was the product of love, bravery, and resilience. But in truth, nothing could have prepared Rocco for the silent detonation that would rip through the foundation of his existence, triggered not by an accident or an enemy, but by a file, an old, neglected digital record hidden among Brooke Lynn's folders at the Quartermain estate. That one careless exposure changed everything. Brooke Lynn, in an attempt to protect Rocco from uncovering too much too soon, had failed to secure a document linked to the late Britt Westbourne. The document was meant to remain sealed, buried with the secrets of a generation that had blurred the lines between medical miracle and moral disaster. But when Rocco stumbled upon it, the content was too specific, too clinical, too shocking to be dismissed as a coincidence. Birth dates aligned too perfectly. Genetic indicators matched too closely. There were too many references to fertility protocols, in vitro anomalies, and mitochondrial pairings to ignore. In the moment that followed, Rocco was transformed. The boy who had once idolized his parents and embraced the mythology of his family's past now sat alone, hunched over a screen, questioning the most basic truths of his existence. The walls of the Quartermain home seemed to close in, pressing down with suffocating weight. The warmth of family photos hanging on the walls now felt artificial. Every memory, every bedtime story, every whispered, "I love you," now carried the bitter aftertaste of deception. Laura Collins, the ever-steady matriarch of the Spencer family, attempted to intervene. She spoke gently, her voice full of maternal affection, reminding Rocco that he was wanted, cherished, and born out of hope. But the words didn't reach him. They felt rehearsed. Hollow. Rocco needed more than comfort. He needed answers, real ones, not filtered through love, fear, or guilt. With the tenacity inherited from both sides of his lineage, Rocco made a choice. He would seek the truth on his own terms. Late at night, when the house was asleep and the storm within him refused to calm, he composed a simple but powerful email. It was directed to Liesl Albrecht, a name once spoken in shadows, always with caution. The message was brief: "I'm your grandson. I know something is wrong. I need you to tell me the truth. All of it." Then he clicked send. No one could have predicted what followed. Within 72 hours, the air in Port Charles grew thick with tension. Old rumors surfaced. Hospital staff whispered in corners. And then, without fanfare or warning, Liesl Albrecht returned. Her arrival was not announced through press conferences or family visits. She appeared at General Hospital like a ghost called home, not by guilt, but by responsibility. Those who knew her past met her with suspicion. Liesl had once been a symbol of the darker chapters of the hospital's history, a brilliant mind corrupted by moral ambiguity. But this time, she didn't return as a villain. She came back as a woman burdened by the weight of truth and the need to pass it down to a child who had unknowingly inherited its consequences. Rocco was waiting in the hospital's psychological counseling wing, though he had refused to see any professionals. He was beyond help, he thought. No therapist could undo what he had read. No counselor could stitch together the rupture that had split his identity in two. When Liesl walked in, the room grew cold and silent. The connection between them, though biologically remote, was immediate and electric. Rocco looked at her not with fear, but with an intensity that demanded honesty. Liesl did not soften the blow. She believed in science, in truth, and in the ownership of one's past. And so, she began to unravel the story layer by layer, like peeling back gauze from an old wound. She explained how, years ago, during a time of political and medical instability, she had participated in, and in some ways directed, a series of covert fertility trials. These experiments were built upon a foundation of desperation and hope, funded by shadow organizations seeking to explore gene editing, accelerated embryonic development, and the preservation of family legacies through engineered life. Britt Westbourne, her daughter, had been drawn into the program both as a subject and as a contributor. Desperate to establish a familial line after years of romantic and maternal disillusionment, Britt had consented to the use of her own genetic material in a highly classified embryo creation project. What no one outside a few trusted operatives knew was that one of those embryos had been implanted in Lulu Spencer. Lulu, unaware of the full scope of the experiment, believed the procedure was a last-ditch IVF process. But in truth, it was more complex. The embryo she carried, and the child who would later be born, contained not just her and Dante's DNA, but also a combination of genetic sequences from Britt Westbourne, integrated through a mitochondrial override process. Liesl described the procedure with clinical detachment, but her eyes betrayed sorrow. She had seen the fallout from such experiments too often to pretend this was just another scientific breakthrough. Rocco sat frozen. Part of him wanted to reject it outright, to accuse Liesl of fabrication or manipulation. But the other part, the part that had felt different for years without knowing why, believed every word. Suddenly, the tension he'd always sensed between his own instincts and his parents' stories made sense. The odd medical concerns in early childhood, the subtle overprotectiveness from Dante, the discomfort in Lulu's eyes whenever his birth was mentioned. It all fell into place like a grotesque puzzle finally completed. Liesl reached out, but Rocco pulled away. The room was too small, the air too dense. He needed space, distance, clarity. He needed to understand who he was, not just biologically, but philosophically. Was he a triumph of science? A failure of ethics? A legacy of love, or an artifact of manipulation? The days that followed were a blur. Dante and Lulu were crushed when they discovered that Rocco had gone behind their backs to contact Liesl. Dante, in particular, exploded with anger, demanding to know why Liesl had returned, what damage she intended to inflict this time. But Lulu, though equally shaken, recognized the truth: their son deserved honesty, no matter how dark. Rocco withdrew from everyone. He stopped answering texts, skipped family dinners, and ignored Laura's calls. At school, he became quieter, distant, his eyes scanning every face as if searching for the part of himself that might exist in others. He visited Britt's memorial plaque one afternoon, kneeling before it with trembling hands, silently pleading for understanding. Though she had died years ago, her essence lived on within him, an inheritance of brilliance, tragedy, and complexity. Eventually, Liesl offered Rocco one final gift, a personal dossier. Letters, research notes, photographs, and audio files from Britt herself, chronicling her decision to contribute to the program. In them, Britt explained that she had never meant to create pain, only to give life a second chance. That she had hoped, maybe foolishly, that her legacy could be one of love through science. For Rocco, the documents were not closure, but a new beginning. He now carried two legacies. The legacy of the Falconeri-Spencer line, built on courage and compassion, and the Westbourne-Albrecht lineage, forged in brilliance, risk, and redemption. He would never again be able to see himself as ordinary, but perhaps, just perhaps, he could learn to see himself as whole. Meanwhile, Liesl Albrecht's reappearance in Port Charles sent tremors rippling through the city's core, disturbing not just old alliances, but reawakening shadows many thought were long buried. Her return was more than just a familial matter or a quiet reckoning with the past, it became a catalyst that began to fracture the delicate balance of power and trust within a town already on edge. Though ostensibly back to respond to Rocco's plea for truth, whispers began spreading through General Hospital and law enforcement circles alike, suggesting that her timing was anything but coincidental. Anna Devane, ever vigilant and deeply attuned to the nuances of espionage and hidden motives, quickly grew suspicious. The timing, to her trained mind, was too precise. Liesl returned just as a string of erratic behaviors began to surface, specifically those surrounding Vaughn, a man whose history was still shrouded in secrecy, and whose charm barely concealed a dangerous duplicity. Anna began revisiting files, cross-referencing security reports and internal memos, piecing together an alarming pattern that linked Vaughn's recruitment, assignments, and now his sudden entanglement with both Emma and Jocelyn, to a timeline that eerily overlapped with Liesl's known activities from years past. Jocelyn Jack's impulsive and emotionally charged decision to rescue Vaughn from a tense standoff with Emma did little to quiet those suspicions. Her ultimatum, "It's her or me," wasn't just about personal feelings, it hinted at deeper entanglements, possibly even coercion or manipulation. Jocelyn's protective stance, juxtaposed against Vaughn's erratic retreat and Emma's stolen keycard, painted a disturbing picture. The key, still clutched tightly in Emma's pocket, became a symbol of what lay beneath the surface: unspoken connections, dangerous secrets, and an unseen hand orchestrating the lives of those too young to understand the stakes. As Anna tracked Vaughn's movements, she noted how often his actions mirrored those of operatives once affiliated with underground divisions, individuals who had, at various points in history, worked under or alongside Liesl Albrecht. Though there was no direct evidence, the correlation was haunting. Anna, unable to ignore the implications, began quietly reopening old files and quietly meeting with former WSB contacts, determined to uncover whether Port Charles had once again become a battlefield for experimental agendas disguised as personal vendettas. Elsewhere, in the dim lighting of the Brown Dog Bar, Isaiah Gannon watched the slow disintegration of Curtis and Portia's marriage with an expression that bordered on weary detachment and quiet concern. The bar had become a neutral zone. A place where secrets spilled as freely as drinks. Curtis, usually composed and calculated, now appeared fractured, haunted by the weight of past deceptions and the burden of protecting a legacy that was rapidly crumbling. Portia, no less shaken, began to spiral into self-blame, accusing herself of being the architect of her own heartbreak. Isaiah, more observant than he let on, noticed how their arguments circled the same themes: secrets, loyalty, betrayal. He also noticed how the name Jordan Ashford surfaced far too frequently, as if she remained a phantom presence looming between them. Their marriage, once built on promises of second chances and healing, now teetered on the precipice of silent collapse. At the same time, another emotional fracture widened elsewhere in the city. Gio Palmieri, still reeling from Rocco's emotional breakdown, found himself incapable of forgiving Brooke Lynn for the irreversible damage she had caused. In his eyes, she had failed to protect Rocco, not just from the truth, but from the trauma of discovering it in such an abrupt, isolating way. His anger was raw and relentless, a fire that scorched every attempt at reconciliation. What had once been a supportive bond between them had now morphed into a cold, hostile distance. Brooke Lynn, devastated and riddled with guilt, tried to make amends, but her words only deepened Joe's resentment. Every apology sounded like an excuse. Every tear felt manipulative. Amid all these unraveling threads, marriages deteriorating, friendships imploding, and loyalties being questioned, Rocco stood quietly at the epicenter of it all, holding a truth far too heavy for a boy his age to bear. Though he had the information he sought, the answers brought him no peace. Instead, they became a labyrinth through which he wandered, uncertain if there was ever an exit. His world had become fragmented. Nothing looked familiar anymore. Not his family, not his friends, not even his own reflection. Liesl, to her credit, remained at his side. She vowed never to abandon him, promising to guide him through the labyrinth of his identity with honesty and strength. She saw in him the echoes of Brit's defiance, Lulu's compassion, and Dante's grit, all conflicting forces now converging in a young man who no longer knew where he belonged. She stayed close, offering scientific explanations when he asked, emotional support when he faltered, and silence when he just needed space. But even Liesl's presence, steady and resolute, could not silence the storm inside Rocco. Her revelations may have satisfied his intellectual curiosity, but they did nothing to address the emotional disorientation that now plagued him. He began to question everything: Was he truly loved, or merely a symbol of scientific ambition? Were Dante and Lulu his parents in spirit or only in circumstance? And if he was created through an experiment, did that make his soul, his sense of self, any less authentic? These questions haunted him in quiet moments, on park benches where he used to play, in the back pew of the church where he once lit candles for the safety of his family, and in the quiet corridors of the hospital where he was born. The Port Charles he had grown up in now felt like a foreign land, populated by people who had played roles in a script he hadn't even known existed. Even as the town pulsed with new scandals, shifting allegiances, and the quiet return of old threats, Rocco remained suspended between two worlds, the child he had been, and the man he was now being forced to become far too soon. The city might move on, might eventually be consumed by the next big secret, the next emotional implosion. But for Rocco, time had slowed, thickened, and warped. He could not outrun the truth, nor could he unknow it. And as Port Charles watched, mostly unaware of the transformation taking place within him, Liesl Albrecht stood vigil. Not as a criminal, not as a former villain, not even as a grandmother, but as the only person in his life right now who understood what it meant to be made from secrets, and to survive them. When Dante Falconeri discovered that his son had reached out to Liesl Albrecht, had gone behind his back to directly contact a woman whose name was synonymous with chaos and trauma in Port Charles, his concern transformed into visceral, unfiltered rage. As a detective, Dante had long trained himself to remain composed in moments of crisis, to separate emotion from action. But this was different. This was personal. This was his son. The thought of Rocco being exposed to Liesl's twisted history, one filled with morally bankrupt experiments, dangerous allegiances, and unrepentant ambition, sent alarm bells ringing in every corner of his mind. He saw the past looming again, threatening to unravel the fragile peace he had spent years constructing around his family. Dante's reaction was immediate. He paced the halls of the Quartermain estate, throwing accusations and questions into the air like weapons without targets. How had Rocco found her contact information? Why hadn't anyone stopped him? How could Liesl dare come back, after everything she had done? He was furious not just at the situation, but at himself, for letting his guard down, for assuming that the ghosts of the past had been buried for good. But Lulu stood in quiet opposition. She, too, had been shaken to the core by the news. She had seen Rocco's face that morning, the distance in his eyes, the quiet finality in his voice. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't cried. He had simply shut down, folding into himself like a door that had been closed too long. And that haunted her more than any outburst ever could. Lulu understood something Dante refused to accept in that moment. Their son wasn't just a child hurt by secrets, he was a soul fractured by the absence of truth. Lulu approached Dante with measured calm, though her own emotions were roiling beneath the surface. She reminded him that love, no matter how fierce, could not shield someone from their identity. That no amount of parental protection could substitute for self-knowledge. She had once believed, as Dante did now, that certain truths were better left buried. But looking into her son's hollow, wounded eyes, she realized that ignorance, when built on falsehoods, was far more dangerous than the truth itself. She pleaded with Dante to let Rocco have this reckoning. To let him face what they had been too afraid to confront. Not because Liesl was trustworthy or safe, she wasn't, but because Rocco had earned the right to ask the questions that defined his own existence. And if they tried to silence him now, they would not just lose his trust, they would lose him completely. The truth had already been unearthed. It could not be reburied. Rocco now knew that his birth was not solely the product of love, but also the consequence of a calculated experiment. An intersection between science, desperation, and ambition. He was no longer simply the cherished son of Dante and Lulu, the curious boy who grew up surrounded by legacy and loyalty. He had become something far more complicated, a living embodiment of a generation's darkest secrets, a symbol of everything that could go wrong when human beings play God under the guise of salvation. The consequences of this revelation rippled far beyond their home. In the hallways of General Hospital, in the dusty archives of WSB files, and in the whispered conversations between former colleagues of Liesl, a new sense of unease began to take root. Rocco wasn't just a child wrestling with identity, he was a ticking time bomb of ethical reckoning. His existence raised questions that no one wanted to answer. How many others were there? What else had been done in the name of progress? And who had signed off on the experimentation that made him possible? For Liesl, the meeting with her grandson was both a personal reckoning and a professional reckoning. She had walked back into Port Charles expecting to provide answers, but she had underestimated the magnitude of what her presence would reignite. She was no longer simply the disgraced scientist or the estranged grandmother. She was now the gatekeeper of a truth that had implications far beyond one boy's identity. Her work, once hidden in shadowy labs and whispered about in corners of elite medical circles, was coming into the light, and with it came accountability. Liesl could feel the pressure mounting. She had opened the door to Rocco's origin, but in doing so, she had also opened the door to scrutiny. The past, it seemed, would not rest quietly. For every truth she revealed, more questions emerged, each more damning than the last. She knew there were files still locked away, names still protected, programs still classified. And she knew that once the world began to dig, it wouldn't stop.